Hello, everyone. My name is Abhinav Bhatele. I am a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland. And today, together with Stephanie Brink from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, we are going to talk about Hatchet as part of this SC tutorial. In this first session, we are talking about the basics of each of the tools in this tutorial. So we'll provide an introduction to Hatchet, talk about the motivations for developing it, talk about some key features and the data structures in Hatchet. All of this information will be useful when we talk about the API that you can use in Hatchet in the next session. I'm going to turn off my video so that it does not block a part of the slides. So I also want to mention that Hatchet development started at Lawrence Livermore when I was a computer scientist there. It's now a vibrant project. It has an open source community. We have contributions, of course, both from Maryland and Lawrence Livermore, but also from several academic partners at UTK, Arizona, and UC Davis. So we saw in the first session that provided basics of performance analysis that end users are trying to optimize their parallel software, and it's critical to understand performance bottlenecks to be able to do that. There are many profiling and tracing tools that can help us identify what parts of my code do I spend most of my time in. In addition, we would also like to find out that when a function is called from different places in the code, do we spend different time in that function? This is called attributing performance or execution time to different calling contexts. Now, to be able to attribute performance to different calling contexts, we require a reasonable understanding of the code structure. So for example, in the example here on the right, the function PSM2 is called from two different places through physics and MPI or through solvers and MPI. And we would like to understand when PSM2 is called from two different places or context, do we spend more time in one scenario versus the other? Now, thankfully, there are many sophisticated profilers that can attribute time to calling contexts and also tell us where was a function called from and how much time did I spend in this function when called from different contexts. Some examples of such measurement tools are HPC Toolkit, Caliper, Temery. Those three are being covered in this tutorial. There are also other tools such as Scorpy, Tau, and others that also provide similar information. If you are working on a Python code, you might already be using cProfile or PyInstrument, and those tools also provide similar information. Now, we talked about this in the introductory session, but just for completeness, I'm going to again mention what a calling context tree is and what a call graph is. So the profilers that we talked about on the last slide, they typically produce output that looks somewhat like this if you were to visualize it. For each function where a sample is recorded by these performance tools, we might have some time recorded in these functions, and you also have the entire calling context for that function. So for example, if Garply is called from Waldo and then Waldo is called from Foo, we record that call path, but we also record how much time is spent in Garply when it's called through this call path. There are many kinds of information that might be stored on these nodes, both contextual and performance related. The other kind of data that we might have from such tools is somewhat more aggregated compared to a calling context tree. So if we did not specifically record how much time is spent when calling a function in different contexts, but we still recorded the different contexts, we would get a call graph. So if you take a function, let's say Garply, and you merge all the instances of the calls to Garply into a single node, you get a call graph from a calling context tree. Okay, so there are many such tools that can give us this data. And as we started looking at this space of measurement tools, we realized that many of these tools also come with their own analysis tools. However, the analysis tools are somewhat limited in the kinds of things an end user can do with them. So first of all, each analysis tool typically supports its own unique format. They also have limited support for saving or automating analysis. So if you wanted to do the same analysis again, you have to you restart the tool, you have to follow all of those steps again. Most tools only support viewing one data set at a time. If you were to compare two different executions, you will have to open two graphical interfaces and manually compare them side by side. Many tools also lack capabilities to sub-select or focus on specific parts. In some many analysis tools that are currently out there, they do not enable programmatic analysis of the data by the end user. And this is where we thought there was a gap in the performance analysis area, and we wanted to develop a tool that would make it easier for end users to do performance analysis. So the main idea behind Hatchet is to use Python. Hatchet is a Python-based library, and it enables programmatic analysis for the end user. We support calling context trees and call graphs, and we create an in-memory representation of the graph. We leverage pandas, which is a Python-based library that supports multi-dimensional tabular datasets. I'll talk about pandas in a subsequent slide. And the key idea that we have used in Hatchet is to use the graph as a structured index that helps us index the data frames in pandas. Based on this in-memory representation of our call graph, we came up with a set of operators to sub-select or aggregate profile data. And in addition, we have a set of operators that help us compare across multiple executions or data sets from multiple executions. So before we jump into the details of Hatchet, I want to give a brief introduction to pandas and data frames. Pandas is an open source Python library for data analysis. There are two key data structures in pandas, a series and a data frame. In Hatchet, we use the data frame data structure. A data frame is a two-dimensional tabular data structure. It supports many operations borrowed from SQL databases. And the data structure looks something like the figure on the right. There are rows and columns. Each row is indexed by a default index, but you can also provide custom indices, which is what we do in Hatchet. The columns can be categorical or they can have numerical information. So you can really store anything in these columns, and they can be sparse. So you don't have to have all rows filled with data for all of the columns. Pandas also supports a multi-index. So you can use that for working with higher dimensional data in a two-dimensional data structure. Now, how do we use this information in Hatchet or this capability in Hatchet? We basically load the profile data, that's a calling context tree or call graph, as an in-memory graph. And we use this graph as a structured index. The structured index is used to index different rows of the data frame. Each node in our graph is assigned a unique key, which enables using these nodes as unique indices into the data frame. Each node also has a frame that describes the code that it represents. A frame is a set of key value pairs. So for example, if a node represents a function in the code, it might have a type called function and a name called foo. If a node represents a statement or a loop in the program, then its type might be a statement or a loop, and it might have a file and line number associated with it. Frames don't have a rigid schema, and their schema really depends on the measurement tool that was used to generate the data. The nodes in our in-memory graph define the structure and connectivity. So they define the caller-callee relationships between different nodes, and all of the numerical information is stored in the data frame. So once we have this structured index and we have the data frame from pandas, we combine these two together, and that defines the central data structure in Hatchet, which is called a graph frame. A graph frame consists of a structured index graph object and a pandas data frame. The graph itself stores caller-callee relationships, as we've seen in the previous slides, and the data frame stores all of the numerical and categorical data associated with each node. Most of the API operations that we provide in Hatchet are built on top of this graph frame. Now, since we are at a high-performance computing conference, most often users will be running programs that are multi-process if they're running MPI or multi-threaded, and we support loading such data into Hatchet. Whenever there are metrics on each node that are per MPI process or per thread, we use the multi-index capability in pandas to create a hierarchical index of the node comma rank or node comma rank comma thread, and that can give us a hierarchical index that can be used to index the data frame. Each node then has per rank data or per rank per thread data and so on. which is what is shown in this data frame here. Now next, when we provide end users with a data frame and a graph that indexes into the data frame, having direct references to the graph nodes in the data frame can be risky, because if the user modifies the graph, we might lose the graph and data frame relationships. This is especially important when graph nodes are shared by multiple graph frames. To avoid situations where data might get corrupted, we use immutable semantics for the graph nodes. So any operation that might modify graph nodes in place creates a new graph frame and a new graph index. This way, our graph and the data frame always stay consistent. This is implemented using copy on write semantics in Hatchet. Now, Hatchet supports many different file formats. We support .cali and .json files that can be generated using Caliper. In addition, we support both kinds of profiling that Caliper supports, the annotation and region profiles, but also sampling-based call path profiles. From HPC Toolkit, we have support for per process data that is generated by using HPC prop-MPI. We support data generated from Timmery. It can be a dictionary or a file stream or JSON. We also support file formats from Tau and some other tools such as gprof2dot. We also support file formats from Python profilers, so cprofile and PyInstrument. So if you're using that, you can still use Hatchet. The last thing I'll talk about in this introductory session is how do you start reading in an input data set. And then in the next session, we'll talk about what kinds of operations can you do when you want to use Hatchet. So installing Hatchet is easy. It's available on pip. So you can just say pip install Hatchet and get the latest release of Hatchet. Alternatively, since Hatchet is a actively developed software, and if you wanted to get the bleeding edge development version from GitHub, you can clone the GitHub repo from this URL, and then you can run install.sh in the Hatchet directory to install Hatchet. Once you've installed Hatchet, reading in a data set is really easy. For example, if you use HPC Toolkit to generate some profiling data for your code, you can use the from_HPC Toolkit function, and we have similar functions for each profiling tool that can help you load the data into a graph frame. As I said, we provide support for many performance tools, but if there's a performance tool or a particular file format that we do not currently support, we welcome contributions in terms of pull requests to our Hatchet repository. So I think that's all I have for this introductory session on Hatchet. In the next session, we'll talk about the API operations. Thank you.